Hello, and welcome to the first in a new series of videos designed to help you revise for the Shakespeare section of your Literature GCSE. In each of these videos, we will be running through key quotations for each character in the play Macbeth, delving deep into Shakespeare's use of language linked to the themes of the play. As always, please remember that these videos are intended as a jumping off point. They're ideas to get you started, and there's so much more that could be said about each of these quotations. Nevertheless, I hope that you'll find these videos a useful place to begin. As Macbeth is our main character, I've selected a whole 15 quotations from throughout the play that I think are interesting as we consider Shakespeare's development of this character throughout the play. We will look at the first 5 quotations in this video, and I'll be uploading the next videos shortly. So our first quotation comes from Act 1, Scene 3, in which Macbeth expresses his very first thoughts about regicide. And our quotation is, "Why do I yield to that suggestion whose horrid image doth unfix my hair?" Now this quotation is given immediately after Macbeth finds out that he has been given the title of Thane of Cawdor, and he now has reason to believe in the witch's prophecies. This is part of his soliloquy beginning, "Two truths are told." In this quotation, Macbeth is questioning why he is drawn to thoughts of murdering Duncan. So let's break this down, and we're going to look at each of the key words or short phrases that I've underlined here, our first being the word yield. Now, yield means to give in or to surrender, and this is an example of military language, quite suited to Macbeth given his skill on the battlefield. And that word yield suggests that Macbeth is giving in to ideas of killing Duncan, illustrating that he's tempted by the thought of regicide. He refers to the idea of regicide as a suggestion. Now this tells us that the idea of killing Duncan has already occurred to Macbeth, almost as soon as he's heard these prophecies. So if you're thinking that Macbeth doesn't consider the idea of regicide until he discusses it with his wife, this proves that idea false. Almost as soon as Macbeth is given those prophecies by the witches, his ambition is ignited, and he starts thinking of ways that he can achieve the throne. Nevertheless, he refers to it as a horrid image, and those words reveal that the thought of regicide appalls Macbeth. He's horrified by it. Now remember, in the time that this play is set, a king was considered to be God's mouthpiece on earth. He's one step down from God in the great chain of being. So not only is regicide a crime, it's also a grave sin, a really serious moral failing. It goes against absolutely everything that Macbeth has stood for up until this point in his life, so he calls it a horrid image. The thought disgusts him. In fact, he goes so far as to say that it unfixes his hair. The idea of murdering Duncan makes his hair stand on end. So he's haunted and fascinated by these thoughts at the same time that they repulse and repel him. But we see here very clearly he is already thinking about that murder. Shortly afterwards, we see his further thoughts about these prophecies, as he says, "If chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir." Now, this quotation comes shortly after the previous one, and here Shakespeare expresses one of the play's central themes. Must we act to bring about our fate, or is it in fact beyond our control? Is it destined to happen anyway? Once Macbeth tries to take control of his fate by killing Duncan in order to claim the throne, he's forced to continue trying to master his fate in an increasingly bloody and terrifying series of events. Here, in this line, we see his reluctance to kill Duncan, as well as we see his desire for power himself. So let's break it down. He refers to chance, and this word means fate. Here, Macbeth questions the power of fate. Does it control his life, or is he in control of himself? He also refers to being king. The witches greeted Macbeth previously. "Hail Macbeth, thou shalt be king hereafter." And we see what a powerful grip that idea has on Macbeth's imagination. He's constantly imagining himself in that position of power, sitting on Duncan's throne. But he also says, "Chance may crown me without my stir. Fate may give me the throne without my having to do anything." And that phrase, "without my stir," refers to the idea of actions. Stir means action, so without my stir means without me having to do anything. Macbeth is wondering whether he must in fact take any action, killing Duncan for instance, in order to make the prophecies a reality. Perhaps he thinks he will simply become king without having to do anything. Now, that idea seems to be proven false when Duncan later explains that he wishes to have Malcolm follow him, be next in line for the throne, to be his heir, and that's the point at which Macbeth decides that he is going to go through with the idea of regicide. But we still are left with that question. Would Macbeth have become king anyway, or is it something that he brought about by committing that crime, that regicide? Moving on a little bit to Act 1, Scene 7. Here we have Macbeth's soliloquy in which he wonders whether or not regicide is the right course of action. In that soliloquy, that speech that he gives himself with no one else on stage, expressing his thoughts to the audience, he reveals his internal conflict about the regicide. He has no motive for killing Duncan except for his ambition, and he knows that the consequences of committing such a crime will be dire. The play opened, after all, with Macbeth brutally executing a man who was a traitor to King Duncan, so we know as an audience that the penalty for treason is death. Here, Macbeth worries that he could be killed in the same way as Duncan if he were to go through with that crime. He says, "We but teach bloody instructions which, being taught, return to plague the inventor. If I go and commit violent acts, other people will learn from me and potentially commit those same acts of violence against me," he says. So when he refers to bloody instructions, this literally means bloody lessons. Macbeth is worrying that if he commits a violent crime, regicide, others will learn from him and do the same. Perhaps he worries he could be killed in the same way that he plans to kill Duncan. Now this phrase, return to plague the inventor, I think is such a powerful one. Plague as a word connotes ideas of sickness and disease. Violence in this play is presented as being like a sickness. It spreads like a contagion. Once that first violent act is committed, the murder of Duncan, Macbeth sets in motion this unstoppable chain of increasingly bloody and violent acts that lead ultimately to his own death. And these lines also act as foreshadowing. Macbeth predicts correctly the fatal outcome of his actions, but he kills Duncan anyway. This suggests to us that the idea of attaining the throne is so powerful to Macbeth that he's willing to risk all kinds of horrific penalties for doing so. The tragic conclusion, Macbeth's bloody death at the hands of Macduff, is inevitable and it is inexorable. It's unstoppable. He knows that this is going to happen. He knows that if he commits this crime, he dooms himself, but the temptation to achieve the throne is too great and he does it anyway. Continuing in this same soliloquy, Macbeth ends that soliloquy by admitting his only motivation to kill Duncan is his burning ambition. This was ignited by the witch's prophecies, and it is now the driving force behind his thoughts of murder. Ambition is Macbeth's fatal flaw, his hamartia, and Macbeth here demonstrates his knowledge that it will lead to his downfall. He says, "I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other." Now, this is a slightly complex line. It's one of the most famous in the play, but it requires careful analysis. Here, no spur means no motivation. A spur is a tool that prompts a horse to move, and in this metaphor, Shakespeare illustrates the idea that Macbeth has no reason to kill Duncan and no motivation or desire to do so. In this soliloquy, he explains that Duncan has been a good king, a noble king, someone admirable with no real faults, and Macbeth has been loyal to him for a long time, so he doesn't have that desire or that reason to go ahead with this crime, except for his ambition. Vaulting ambition is Macbeth's fatal flaw, the only thing driving him to kill Duncan. It is his hamartia. And in this metaphor, vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other, Shakespeare compares Macbeth's ambition to an over-eager rider that aims to jump, vault into the saddle, but goes too far and falls on the other side of the horse. Again, Macbeth seems here to recognise that his actions will bring about his downfall eventually. He's saying he has no motivation to go through with the murder, but his ambition is too eager, it's too powerful, it's driving him to do it anyway. Now, as we progress through Act 1, later in this scene, Macbeth debates the idea of regicide with his wife, Lady Macbeth. While she attempts to emasculate him in an effort to control him and persuade him to go through with the murder, Macbeth responds by asserting his own view of manhood, that a true man would never commit such a terrible crime, such an awful sin. He says, "I dare do all that may become a man. Who dares do more is none." Now, this means that he dares do anything that is fitting and proper for a man to do, and that anyone who would go further is no man at all. That word dare is a really powerful one, connoting as it does ideas of bravery. So Macbeth here is claiming that his decision not to kill Duncan isn't cowardly. He portrays himself as a brave man who dares do everything that a good man would do. Now, become is a tricky word here. When he talks about what becomes a man, he's saying what is right and what is proper for a man to do. As a thane loyal to King Duncan, Macbeth's bravery has always been proven in battle, fighting for his king, and his idea of manhood is based on that. It's built on ideas of bravery, loyalty and honour. Up until this point in his life, that's what being a man has meant to Macbeth, being good, loyal, noble, honourable to your monarch. But now, Lady Macbeth is challenging him with an alternative view of manhood. He goes on to say, "Who dares do more is none. Anyone that would go further than I do is no man at all." He's arguing here that anyone who would do more, that is, commit regicide, would not be a man. That is, he would no longer be loyal or honourable. Lady Macbeth responds by arguing that a true man fights for what he wants. So we see in this discussion between the two characters these competing views of masculinity. Macbeth believes that being a man is doing what is right for your king, for your country, being loyal and honourable, whereas Lady Macbeth claims that it's much more manly to go after what you want yourself, to be that little bit more ambitious and that little bit more selfish and personally driven. And ultimately, it's Lady Macbeth's view of masculinity that drives Macbeth to commit this crime. Okay, so those are our first 5 quotations looking at Act 1 of the play. In our next short video, we're going to be going through another couple of quotations looking at Act 2 and Act 3 and continuing with our deep dive into Shakespeare's language and how he uses it to present Macbeth. I hope this was useful to you. Thank you for listening.